The research team is integrated into the wider medical team. All of our patients are discussed at one of our multidisciplinary team meetings. It's at this point that a patient might be found to be potentially suitable for a clinical trial. They'll then meet one of our research doctors and the research team at their next clinic visit, where they'll be presented with a trial. If a doctor from another hospital wants to refer a patient to us for a clinical trial, they need to write a detailed referral letter, and we'll see them as soon as we can in our clinic.
Generally, we would like to tell the patient as much as possible about a clinical trial so that they can make an informed decision as to whether they would like to take part in it. This generally would involve an initial meeting where we would discuss the general principles of the trial, the potential benefits and the potential risks. We would give the patient a patient information sheet for the patient and their family members to read and to think about. We'd usually arrange for the patient to spend some time with a clinical trial practitioner or research nurse to discuss the study in more detail.
When a patient first comes along for information about the trial, we offer patient information sheets, and I always advise it's a good idea for the patient to discuss these with family members, close friends, just to get better understanding. And sometimes a family member or relative have different questions the patient might not think of.
So the eligibility criteria are a really essential part of the protocol for a clinical trial. This is a long list of inclusion and exclusion criteria that a particular patient going onto a trial will need to meet in order for us to get them onto a trial. An important thing for patients to understand is that this isn't a set of criteria that we as the treating clinicians can influence or waive or make any exceptions to. It's really set in stone in something called the trial protocol, which must be followed.
Now that may depend on many different factors. It may depend on the prior treatment a patient may have received, how fit they are. It may also involve the results of blood tests that the patient's already had, but it may also mandate that the patient should have some additional blood tests or more sophisticated blood tests to check that the heart is functioning properly, the kidneys are functioning properly, as well as extra scans potentially to see at that time point where the lymphoma is.
Sometimes we find that patients don't meet the eligibility criteria to take part in the study. This is usually disappointing for the patient and also for the investigator. However, we would still try and offer the patient the best available treatments that we might have. This might be taking part in another study, or it might be a standard treatment which is available in the clinic.
That's a commonly asked question as to whether a patient can choose which arm of the study they go into, and the bottom line is that that's not up to patient choice. It's also not up to clinician choice. In a randomised controlled trial, it really is a random process that happens behind the scenes, where a patient is randomly allocated to one of a number of treatment arms. And I think it's an important thing for patients going into a trial to understand that they don't get a choice. If they're agreeing and willing to participate in a trial, they are agreeing and willing to receive either treatment, whether that's the control arm or the experimental arm.
If an employer needs clarification of a patient having treatment or how they might be feeling or any precautions they might have to take while in the workplace, we're happy to provide that information.
Patients are often monitored very closely. We'll check their blood counts before each treatment and during follow-up. We may do extra tests such as heart tests or lung function tests. They'll also be scanned regularly during the treatment and after treatment. It's really important that patients on a clinical trial liaise really closely with us and report any side effects, or if they become unwell, they tell us immediately.
If the patient has any questions or queries or worries throughout their treatment, they can direct them to myself or the clinical trials practitioner. We work very closely together. We also work very closely with the clinical nurse specialists in lymphoma. So if there's anything we're not sure about, we're very happy to escalate it further.
Sometimes when you're participating in a clinical trial, the sponsor of the trial might want to make a change or an amendment to the way that we run the trial. This could be a simple thing like adding a new blood test or an extra scan, or changing the way that we do follow-up. If this happens, you might be asked to sign another consent form so that we and the sponsor know that you're happy with the changes to the trial.
In some situations, a patient may decide that they don't want to be part of a study. They may have decided that before embarking on the trial, or they may decide that during the trial. And the most important thing for a patient to know is that being part of a clinical trial is entirely voluntary, and at any point a patient can withdraw from a clinical trial. They don't have to justify any reason, and our priority as the doctor looking after a patient is to make sure that we identify the best treatment option for the patient, whether they remain on the trial or they choose to come off the trial.
If a patient becomes ill or thinks they're unwell on a clinical trial, between appointments, they must contact us immediately and we will get advice from their medical team about what to do. It may mean coming to hospital sooner than expected or going directly to their local A&E.
If during a trial it becomes clear that a patient may have suffered harm from a medication, then this is immediately notified to the sponsor, and the sponsor will disseminate this information to the other sites so that other patients are protected.
Your information, your data is shared within the medical teams. That could be your GP and any relevant medical staff in the hospital, and this is to ensure your safety and make sure that we understand what we need to report to the sponsor.
Your GP will be sent a letter when you start a clinical trial. They're also sent all of your clinic letters so they understand what's going on throughout your treatment and follow-up. We often liaise closely with the GP, as sometimes they may need to prescribe supportive medication while you're on a clinical trial.
So when a patient is enrolled in a trial, they're given an information sheet and they sign a consent form that states that all patient data is anonymised. So this means that we don't use any patient details, we don't use their name, and every patient is assigned an ID number that is used to identify them to the sponsor throughout the trial.
After patients finish treatment on a clinical trial, they go into a follow-up period. Usually this starts with intervals of a couple of months, and then as they get further away from treatment, the intervals between clinic visits get longer and longer. Sometimes they might be followed up for many years, or even for the rest of their lives. Often during this period we'll do blood tests and scans just to make sure that they're still well throughout the follow-up period.
At the end of the trial, the sponsor will come to our site more regularly and we'll go through a process of what's called data cleaning, where we review all the documents and the data to ensure that it is complete and accurate. Once this is done, the sponsor will run a series of analysis on the data and raise any final questions that they might have. After this, the findings can be written up and then they're published by the sponsor.
If trial results become available while a patient is still on a clinical trial or in follow-up, then we will tell them about the results during their clinic visit. Sometimes the sponsors will produce information sheets about the results of the trial, which carefully explain what happened after the trial and what the results mean. Sometimes sponsors like Cancer Research UK will publish the results on their website for the patients to see.